groups claim greater political power at the ballot box, we inevitably see a backlash from those in power and a contraction of voting rights, a phenomenon that's been particularly borne by people of color. In addition, we'll also discuss with you how voting rights and access to voting have been impacted more generally by COVID-19 this election, in terms of how voting rules are evolving, or in some cases not, to meet this moment, to ensure voters can vote freely and fairly without having to sacrifice their health or the health of their families. We also want to share with you how the COVID-19 pandemic has been intentionally weaponized by the Trump administration to prevent people from being able to vote on a fair and equal basis, and to undermine the representation in our democratic institutions at both the federal and state levels. And we'll end by discussing the efforts of the ACLU and many of our sister organizations to fight back against these attacks on our democracy. So before we get to our main agenda, I do want to give an overview of what I've generally classified as the three main categories of threats to voting rights, because Bobby and I are going to address all of these in some form this evening. And while there's certainly overlap, it is important to differentiate these three threat categories. So the first are election administration failures. So this is when things go wrong operationally when running elections. We're talking about nuts and bolts issues, for example, with voter registration problems or voting machine malfunctions or long lines at polling locations because there are not enough poll workers or poll books to check in voters. A lot of these issues crop up because American elections are run on shoestring budgets. The second category of threats is voter suppression. I think about voter suppression as measures, either laws, rules, or practices that generally make it harder to vote, with the expectation that the burden will fall disproportionately on historically marginalized and underrepresented groups, and thus help swing elections. So we're talking about people of color, we're talking about young people, we're talking about language minority voters. So these are tactics like cutting early voting or not providing enough language assistance, making it harder to register, restricting voter registration drives, photo ID laws, and improper or unlawful sometimes voter purges, which is the practice of removing voters from the voter registration rolls. And the last category, which has a lot of overlap with voter suppression, are racially discriminatory voting practices. These are practices that target voters based on their race, color, ethnicity, or minority status in a manner that is designed to suppress their political power. So Black voters, Latinx voters, Asian Americans, Native American voters have historically and continue to be targeted based on their status as minority voters. And why is this? It's because by diminishing the political power and representation of these groups, it means that the existing power structures can continue to dominate policy outcomes at the expense of the rights of these other voters. So I do want to dig in a little bit into the history of voting rights, because it's very relevant as to why, as a nation, we continue to confront the challenges to the right to vote, and these challenges have been magnified by the COVID-19 pandemic. So since our nation's founding, racial and ethnic minorities have fought pernicious efforts to block them from political representation. After the Civil War and Reconstruction period, when newly emancipated Black men were for a brief period able to exercise their right to vote and held elected office, more than 100 years of state-sanctioned voting discrimination followed, which prohibited Blacks and other racial minorities from political participation. And by the turn of the 20th century, official and systematic attempts to block people from voting based on their race or ethnicity had greatly intensified. Laws were passed in the former Confederate states that were intended to disenfranchise Black voters en masse. So we're talking about things like literacy tests, poll taxes, felony disenfranchisement laws, property qualifications to be able to register to vote. And the reason for these laws was because many whites at the time feared the exercise of political power by minority voters, and these ideologies of racial hierarchy were actually popular concepts undergirding the structure of these state constitutions of these former Confederate states. And so this American history is important to understand for many reasons, but for our purposes, it's a stark lesson about how existing power structures in this country have responded to the growth of political power of racial minorities in this country. So after almost a century of failure to remedy racial discrimination in the voting process and the failure to dismantle state-sanctioned disenfranchisement of African Americans in particular, Congress enacted the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and to this day, the Voting Rights Act remains one of the most powerful legal tools to challenge racial voting discrimination. The most important provisions of the Voting Rights Act over its lifetime are summarized here in this slide, Section 2, Section 5, and Section 203. And importantly, all of its provisions are enforceable in federal court. But the most powerful enforcement tool in the Voting Rights Act is the federal pre-clearance process established by Section 5. Section 5 required certain states and local jurisdictions with the worst records of racial discrimination identified by a coverage formula, which was also in the Act, to pre-clear voting changes with the federal government, either by getting approval from the Department of Justice or from a federal court in DC. And Section 5 required a simple showing. If a jurisdiction could show that the voting change did not discriminate on the basis of race, color, or ethnicity, either in purpose or effect, the voting change would be pre-cleared. But since its initial enactment in 1965 and over the following decades, Section 5 blocked over 1,000 instances of discriminatory election rules being advanced by state and local officials that would have weakened minority voting power or blocked minority voters from casting a ballot altogether. Section 5 also served as a strong deterrent against countless discriminatory voting changes from going forward. And the magic of Section 5 was that a voting change could not be enforced until it was shown to be non-discriminatory. Most of the time, how we challenge laws, laws are enacted, they're challenged in court, and then they're struck down if they violate existing laws or the Constitution. Litigation in this way can take several years, and all the while people are forced to vote under discriminatory conditions or lose their right to vote in those elections. And over the course of its life, its effectiveness in dismantling racial discrimination at the ballot box prompted Congress to reauthorize Section 5 4 times, most recently in 2006. And here's a fun fact for you. Every single Voting Rights Act reauthorization was passed with sweeping bipartisan majorities in the Congress in 1970, 75, 80, and 2006. Each of these years, the bill was signed into law by a Republican president. So for many, many years, there was bipartisan consensus on the importance of protecting the sacred right to vote and against the insidiousness of racial discrimination. That is until America elected its first African-American president. The surge in voter registration and turnout among people of color in 2008 turned out one of the most diverse electorates in American history, and it was met swiftly with legislative retaliation in the states. That is precisely when we began to see voter suppression measures to creep into state legislatures across the country, making it harder to vote. Several of these laws, such as photo ID laws in Texas and South Carolina, were blocked by the pre-clearance process after either the DOJ or federal courts determined that the laws were racially discriminatory. But things came crashing down a few years later when the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, nullified pre-clearance in a 2013 case called Shelby County versus Holder. With that decision, essentially gutting Section 5 of force and effect, the Supreme Court released the worst offenders from federal oversight of their voting changes in the midst of the growing backlash against increased minority voter participation. And it really created the perfect storm. The covered states and even states with less culpable records took the Shelby decision to enact as a signal to enact voting restrictions with impunity, and the floodgates were open to voter suppression and voting discrimination unlike the country had seen in a generation. A wave of voting restrictions were advanced on a national scale, including racially discriminatory photo ID laws, restraints on voter registration, voter purges, cuts to early voting, diminishing the right to vote by absentee ballot, polling place closures or consolidations, and even criminalization of acts associated with voter registration. The right to vote at this time really became defined by a margins game, slicing off margins of the electorate to tip the balance of power in order to swing elections by increasing the burdens on minority voters, making it harder or even impossible for these folks to vote. And so there are two post-Shelby lawsuits in this race to the bottom, as I call it, after Section 5 was essentially gutted by the Supreme Court, that I want to highlight. The first case is Texas versus Holder, which was a challenge to the Texas photo ID law, which actually was part of the litigation team of one of the plaintiffs. The photo ID law in Texas was broadly understood to be one of the strictest photo ID laws in the nation, and it was actually blocked under Section 5 when Section 5 was in force, because it was determined to be racially discriminatory. But immediately after the Shelby County decision, Texas moved to enforce its photo ID law, notwithstanding that determination by the federal court that would discriminate against the state's Black and brown voters. And after a lengthy trial, a federal court determined that not only did the Texas law have an impermissible discriminatory effect on Hispanics and African Americans, but that Texas actually did this on purpose, which is a pretty high standard, a burden to meet in federal court, to show that a voting change was purposefully discriminatory. The ACLU also challenged a massive voter suppression bill at this time after Shelby that came out of North Carolina, which was enacted shortly after the Shelby County decision. Many parts of North Carolina were also covered by Section 5 preclearance. The North Carolina law massively cut back on early voting. It eliminated the same-day registration law. It instituted photo ID. It rolled back absentee voting rights, the whole gamut. In nullifying that law, after several years of litigation, a federal appeals court concluded that the law had targeted African American voters with almost, quote, surgical precision. And the court based this on evidence that the state actually used its own racial data to craft the policies to specifically make it harder for Black voters to vote in the state. So both of these cases were litigated under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is a nationwide general prohibition against racial discrimination in the voting process. And these were ultimately successful in bringing down these laws, or at least mitigating their impact. But these outcomes only came after years of litigation proceeded, time in which elections were held and hundreds of government officials were elected under discriminatory conditions. So that's what I want to share with you about the history of voting rights pre-COVID and how race sort of underlies a lot of the issues we've been seeing from throughout American history. And right now I want to pass it over to Bobby to talk about COVID and how COVID has impacted our methods of voting and the voting process.
Thanks, Sonia. And thank you so much for consolidating so much information there. I feel like each one of your slides could be dedicated to a book, and I'm sure there is for each one of your slides. Before I jump into voting during COVID, I first would like to recognize kind of the broader impacts of COVID. So far, due to the pandemic, over 1 million deaths worldwide and over 215,000 deaths have occurred here in the United States. The disease has disproportionately impacted the health of racial and ethnic minorities due to longstanding health and social inequities. And as we turn to discussing voting during COVID, we'll also see that it disproportionately impacts the ability of people of color to cast a ballot during this upcoming election. And before we kind of dive into the specifics of voting during COVID, I think it's a really good place to start a conversation about how American elections are very decentralized and governed mostly at the state and local level. Fortunately, the Constitution and federal law creates some boundaries for election administration. One good example of that is the National Voter Registration Act, also known as Motor Voter. It requires states to register individuals to vote while they are having an interaction with state DMVs or motor vehicle agencies. And one other requirement in it is a requirement that states do not have a voter registration deadline longer than 30 days before election day. So they set 30 days out from election day as the bare minimum. And many states have chosen 30 days out from election day to be their deadline. However, many other states allow individuals to register to vote up to and including on election day. In Pennsylvania, the registration deadline was recently moved up. I believe it was 28 days and is now 15 days before election day. So if we had given this lecture in 2018, unfortunately, I wouldn't be able to give the advice that folks should go out and register now, you still have time. But for the most part, elections are governed by state law and administered by local election administrators. So state legislatures really get to decide a lot of policies around voting. They get to decide if individuals are capable of registering to vote online. They get to decide if voters are able to cast a ballot early in person at early voting locations. And they also get to decide policies around vote by mail. So they get to decide who qualifies to vote by mail, when election mail goes out, when it will be processed, when it will be counted before and during election day. And then generally local election administrators, which are primarily at the county level and at the city level in some states, really do all the nuts and bolts of election administration. They process voter registration forms, they recruit poll workers. In many places, they'll go out to high school and register individual voters, and they will mail ballots and process the ballots that are mailed back to them before election day. Moving on to methods of voting. This is something that we're seeing over time. Sonia, I think it's the next slide. Thank you. Over the last few decades, we've seen a great shift in how individual voters are really interested in casting their ballot before election day. So looking back in 2004, roughly about 20% of the electorate voted before election day, and we've seen increases in that each election cycle. However, this election cycle, due to COVID, we're going to see this trend greatly accelerated. So far, we've seen that roughly about 60% of voters are looking to vote by mail this election. When we add in the number of voters that will vote before election day, it's possible that 3/4 of the electorate will have cast a ballot before election day this election cycle, which is really, really exciting. Sonia, will you move to slide 15 for me? Great. Oh, I'm sorry. Can we move to the slide of voting methods in Pennsylvania? Great. So we've also seen a great deal of change in Pennsylvania. In 2016, only 344,000 voters cast a ballot by mail, and there was no opportunity to cast a ballot in person before election day. This was because in Pennsylvania, at that time, individuals were required to provide an excuse before being able to cast an absentee ballot. So only 4% of voters cast a ballot by mail. Fortunately, last legislative session, the state legislature in Pennsylvania made a change in law and are now allowing all individuals, without providing an excuse, to request an absentee ballot. So far this election, 2,630,000 individuals have already requested a ballot, and 437,000 folks in Pennsylvania have already returned their ballot. So we're already 20 days out from election day, well beyond the number of mail ballots cast in Pennsylvania than last election. If we can go to the next slide. Problems to expect due to COVID. I think first and foremost is poll worker shortages. In 2016, the average age of a poll worker was 61 years old. Because many are at high risk of serious illness due to COVID, many will not act as a poll worker this year. Hopefully, many will be replaced that are no longer capable of being a poll worker this cycle by many younger, but unfortunately less experienced poll workers. While many organizations are doing a great deal of work to recruit poll workers for this upcoming election, it's still likely to be a bit of a problem due to not having as many experienced poll workers there on election day. One of the impacts of this will be long lines. One of the impacts that we see of long lines traditionally is in 2016, we saw a great deal of difference between communities of color and the times to wait in those communities than in others. So in 2016, Black voters waited 23 minutes on average before casting a ballot. Hispanic voters waited 19 minutes, and white voters only waited 12. And something that we're seeing already this cycle as we look at early voting and some of the early press reports is that this is already evident this election. If we look to news reports coming out of Gwinnett County in Georgia, which is a predominantly Black county, many voters were waiting hours in line in order to cast a ballot. At one particular early voting location, the wait was 8 hours, but there was so much enthusiasm and so many people willing to wait in that line in order to cast a ballot that it is very encouraging that even though that was occurring, that people were still adamant on waiting and casting their ballot. We also saw a great deal of wait times in Harris County, Texas. And I'm told that in Philadelphia County in Pennsylvania as well, at some of the early vote locations there where individuals can request and cast an absentee ballot at the same time, there were also much longer lines in Philadelphia than they were seeing in other parts of the state. And then next, I'd like to talk a little bit about government response to COVID. Many states have taken proactive steps to expand access to the vote. One great example of that is Nevada, where their state legislature had an emergency session and decided to send vote by mail ballots to every single registered voter for this election due to COVID. And then those voters have the option of returning the ballot in person. They can early vote if they were not already registered. And there will still be polling locations open on election day where individuals will have the opportunity to register and cast a ballot at the same time. So they took a very proactive response to ensure that all eligible voters in Nevada are still able to cast a ballot. In some states, they were not very proactive but still made progress due to litigation brought from ACLU and many other organizations that are now allowing more people to cast a ballot by mail due to restrictions being lifted due to litigation. And then at the federal level, unfortunately, even though ACLU and many other organizations were advocating for minimum standards to be put in place of creating at least 14 days of early voting and allowing all individuals to be able to cast an absentee ballot without an excuse for future elections, Congress did not take any action in terms of expanding access to the ballot in terms of passing federal law. Fortunately, one thing that they did do is provide an extra $400 million in grants to state and local election administrators to help in response to administering elections during COVID. However, most of the estimates were that the states required about $2 billion. So while some relief was given, it was probably not adequate in order to facilitate elections properly this November. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Sonia.
Am I unmuted? Okay, good. So I'm going to talk about now the attacks on our democracy that have been waged by certain individuals we'll discuss in this part of the presentation. So I'm sure many of you who are tonight have at least heard some of the rhetoric being advanced by the president and his party raising the alarms on fraud in voting by mail. Now, voting by mail can result in random voter fraud and people steal mailboxes and all this kind of stuff, right? We're here to tell you that that is bunk. Not to mention the fact that you can see from his Twitter feed here that he can't even get his story straight. In the same week that he's saying that, vote by mail is going to result in substantial fraud and illegal ballots, He's also encouraging people in Arizona to vote by mail and go out and vote and exercise your rights. So are we surprised though? But the saddest part of the president's campaign attacking vote by mail and the legitimacy of the process is that they're doing this precisely because it is the safest option for many voters to be able to exercise their right to vote. Presumably because they want to drive down voter turnout, or presumably because they want to lay the groundwork potentially for unfavorable outcomes in the election. I say there's fraud in the system that allows them to do that. So that's the motivation here. And while we have been hearing about fraud in the voting rights community over megaphones since the election of Barack Obama, never has the rhetoric zeroed in on vote by mail. Fraud was always discussed in the context of in-person voting fraud at polling places, which is showing up to vote, pretending you're someone else, right? Like, very realistic scenario. But the thing to know about that is that people of color are more likely to vote in person historically. So presumably that's why in-person voter fraud was the kind of voter fraud that the voter fraud brigade wanted to attack. So voting by mail is actually a very popular option for people to vote, particularly during the pandemic, obviously because it mitigates the likelihood of person-to-person contact and mitigates the likelihood that people will contract COVID. And voting by mail actually first became popularized during the Civil War when Union soldiers used it to cast their ballots in the presidential election of 1860. So it has historically been used by our military for over 100 years, but not only that, it's been used historically by elderly voters, voters with disabilities, or people who would be residing away from their election jurisdictions, their voting residences during an election. So today, voting is actually a highly sophisticated system in which 34 states plus the District of Columbia, sorry, my kid is here. Voting by mail is a very sophisticated system. 34 states plus the District of Columbia extend to all of their voters. In other words, no excuses needed to vote by mail in these states pre-pandemic. There are also several states, Washington, Oregon, Colorado, and most recently Hawaii, that conduct their elections entirely by mail. So all this to say is that there's two things that you should know. First, voter fraud is extremely rare. Secondly, mail-based voting fraud is extremely rare. Attempts to measure the instances of voter fraud have been empirically measured again and again and again through study after study, which consistently makes clear that voter fraud is not an issue. In fact, the president himself launched an entire presidential commission in 2017 to study the issue and identify cases of voter fraud during the 2016 election. And despite having the backing of the federal government, this commission was unable to encounter a single case of voter fraud. So they came up with 0 instances of voter fraud despite that presidential effort. In fact, it's actually statistically more likely that you will get struck by lightning or there will be a Bigfoot sighting than there is that someone will be committing voter fraud. So again, to emphasize, all voter suppression measures that have been advanced over the past decade plus, including these current voter suppression measures, photo ID, cuts to early voting, cuts to voter registration opportunities, have all been advanced as an argument to combat voter fraud, despite voter fraud not being a thing, right? So vote by mail voter fraud in particular is exceedingly rare, and to the contrary, vote by mail is safe, it's secure, and it's a reliable process on casting a ballot. So in addition to people just not wanting to broadly commit voter fraud because, you know, I don't want to go to jail, there are a lot of procedural safeguards in place to make sure that voting by mail is protected from interference. Things like sophisticated election management systems, ballot tracking and barcodes, signature matching requirements, and voter identification measures. And while empirical studies have repeatedly shown their focus when it comes to voting by mail should not be unsupported claims of fraud, but that voters who do choose to vote by mail can sometimes encounter problems in the process, these problems can be mitigated with proper planning and sufficient funding and resources, something that Congress decided not to do. And so financial and structural support for voting by mail is urgent, given these pandemic conditions where we are seeing a huge surge in interest in voting by mail for the November general. So this brings me to the USPS and vote by mail. I'm sure many of you have read about or heard about the Postal Service being kneecapped or undermined by this administration. That is not untrue, right? But first, a word about the importance of the Postal Service. Voting by mail does not amount to much as a voting option without a functioning postal system to receive and deliver ballots in a timely fashion. And historically, the U.S. Postal Service has been a dedicated and reliable partner to local and state election officials for ensuring balloting materials are sent to their final destination. Unfortunately, the pandemic has caused dire financial straits for the Postal Service, which was already struggling, and that's how this whole thing kind of began, in terms of the tax on the USPS. And despite the Postal Service's critical function in our society, not just for delivering balloting materials, but also for delivering prescriptions and for Americans to conduct their day-to-day business, the agency was actually shortchanged in the first COVID stimulus bill after the president threatened to veto a $2 trillion bill over a few $1 billion for the Postal Service. Congress was able to negotiate a short-term extension to keep the Postal Service solvent, but the Trump administration actually withheld that funding until just recently. But things get actually better, or actually they get worse. In July, the newly appointed Postmaster General, and perhaps by no coincidence, Trump campaign donor Louis DeJoy, who, by the way, like his three predecessors, had no Postal Service experience, instituted major operational cuts that could have actually slowed down mail delivery. For example, by prohibiting overtime. These were framed as cost-cutting measures to help the USPS financially. But these actions actually in terms of cutting postal office operations, actually caused Postal Service employees themselves to sound the alarm bells on how it could impact election mail. And given the importance of the Postal Service to so many Americans, not only to help the election, but again, to have these really critical other services like prescription delivery, there was a huge public backlash against this. So huge that DeJoy actually agreed to freeze the operational cuts he had begun to institute. So there was a backtracking. And there were also several successful lawsuits that blocked these changes from being instituted. And while this is a very scary roller coaster ride that I just described here, that we've been on with USPS for the past few months, having personally worked with congressional and agency staff on this issue, I can tell you that the Postal Service continues to be deeply committed to delivering election mail and to serving our democracy. So don't be scared away from voting by mail if that's the best option for you to exercise your right to vote, because the USPS has the capacity and the commitment to continue its service to voters. But you should know that potential delays from the residual impact of these operational disruptions, there may be impact with respect to timing of delivery of balloting materials. So just make sure you request your ballot and mail in your ballot as soon as possible.
Well, Sonia, I can hear a little bit of an issue with your mic. So I'm not sure if it's an issue with the mic on the computer or if maybe something is touching
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, so maybe, I don't know if it's maybe the papers touching it.
It's probably my papers. Okay, I'm moving to the side. So that brings me back to the same question that we posed at the beginning. Who votes by mail? The president votes by mail. Also, Mike Pence votes by mail. Melania votes by mail. Attorney General Bill Barr votes by mail. Trump's press secretary, his campaign manager, his former campaign manager vote by mail. And let's not forget Javanka. So all of these attacks on vote by mail are bogus, right? These folks don't mind voting by mail. They just don't want you voting by mail. And you should keep this in mind next time you think about whether you want to vote by mail. But I do want to talk about also the 2020 census in terms of attacks on election legitimacy. So every 10 years, what is the 2020 census? What is the census, the decennial census? Every 10 years, the Constitution requires the federal government to conduct a census to count all people in the United States. Everyone is counted without exception. This includes adults, children, citizens, non-citizens. The Constitution states all people shall be counted. And people do this by filling out a census questionnaire, either online or in person, or sometimes if they don't return the census form, someone will come knocking at their door asking them this, questions in the census questionnaire. So this population count is exceptionally important to our democracy because it's used to not only to allocate federal funding for things like healthcare, infrastructure, education, it is also used to apportion and allocate congressional seats and state legislative seats and also electoral college votes. And the 2020 census is actually the largest and most complex population count in our nation's history. One that has been made difficult by the emergence of COVID and the Trump administration's affirmative efforts, as I'll explain, to try to sabotage the 2020 census to serve their political interests. And because the census determines the allocation of funding for these crucial public services, as well as the number of seats in Congress, it is imperative that the Census Bureau gets this count right. So how do you weaponize something as ministerial as a census? You use the count to try to undercount disfavored populations to tip the balance of power away from growing populations. So in 2019, the Trump administration announced that it would include a citizenship question in the census questionnaire being sent to every household in America for the first time in 7 years. So the citizenship question had not been on the census form in 70 years. The White House essentially strong-armed the Census Bureau, which is chock full of career data scientists and Census Bureau personnel to undertake this effort despite unanimous opposition from experts and unanimous oppositions from career scientists inside the Census Bureau, warning that such a question would intimidate immigrants and deter people of color from participating in the census, which would cost these communities these critical government services and political representation. And the ACLU actually challenged the addition of the citizenship question in court, and the documents uncovered during our case revealed that attacking communities of color was precisely the point. The official story, according to the Trump administration, for why they wanted to add the citizenship question was to help enforce Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, right? And its important protections against racial discrimination in voting, despite the fact that the DOJ under Trump has not brought a single Voting Rights Act case in the entire 4 years that he's held office. The reality, as revealed by documents that were obtained during the course of discovery in the ACLU's case, was that, of course, all of this was a lie. And in fact, the purpose of adding the citizenship question was to intentionally reduce the political power of communities of color by 1, scaring them from participating in the census, and 2, by giving states the block level data they needed to literally draw immigrant and communities of color out of their state legislative districts. So in other words, the Trump administration gave as their reason for adding the citizenship question to help improve the political rights of racial minorities, when the actual reason was the exact opposite, to destroy their political rights. The ACLU litigated this case all the way to the Supreme Court, and we won. And it was a huge victory. So despite that, the struggle is continuing. In July, the president issued an executive memorandum that directed the Census Bureau to exclude undocumented people from the census count, which is patently unconstitutional, which I guess if you filed the lawsuit right away and won on a summary judgment motion in the federal court in New York. Additionally, the Trump administration, there has been a historic undercount due to the challenges posed by COVID. Because of that undercount, the career staff at the Census Bureau requested Congress to extend the statutory deadlines by which the Census Bureau had to report the census data. Well, just a short while later, the Trump administration reversed that recommendation, is now trying to ram through the census despite a historic undercount in historically undercounted communities, which include people in rural communities, people in very high dense urban communities, and people, especially people of color and young people. So this fight continues. There is a bipartisan bill in the Senate that the ACLU is trying to advance that would extend the census deadlines, and it is bipartisan because the undercount is going to impact both red and blue states, because both red and blue states don't want to see themselves losing government funding, government services, and they don't want to see themselves losing a congressional seat. So on that happy note, I'm going to send it over back to Bobby.
Great. So we can move on to talking a little bit about how to vote in Pennsylvania, a fantastic topic. So Sonia, if you can move us to the next slide. First and foremost, the most important thing to do is to register. In order to register to vote in Pennsylvania, you have until 15 days before Election Day. So that deadline this year is Monday, October 19th. Online voter registration is available in Pennsylvania. You can go to votespa.com if you aren't registered already and be able to register there. Secondarily, I think the most important thing to do is make a plan to vote. So if you're going to vote by mail, you want to make sure that you request and return your ballot as soon as possible. If you're interested in doing in-person absentee voting and you're on campus, you can do that at the Northampton County Elections Office, which is located at 669 Washington Street in Easton, Pennsylvania. It's open from 8:30 a.m. to 8 p.m. on Monday through Friday, and is open from 8 to 12 on Saturdays. And then you can always vote in person on Election Day as well. We can move to the next slide to talk a little bit about the voting rights landscape throughout the country. I'll be quick here speaking about our litigation so we have time for questions, but we have litigation that is occurring in 20 different lawsuits and counting kind of across the United States that is specifically on voting rights impacted by COVID. In most of these cases, we are challenging overly burdensome requirements on the right to vote by mail. Some of these could be concerns about allowing for individuals to be able to vote without providing an excuse, and secondarily, creating, or invalidating unnecessary witness or notary requirements. One example of that is in Virginia, where I live. Virginia residents are no longer required to provide a witness signature with their absentee ballot for this election. That is because many people, while adhering to social distancing guidelines, it does not make sense for them to go and have a neighbor or a colleague watch them fill out their absentee ballot and sign their witness signature statement and do so while being safe. So we've made quite a few changes to state laws for the upcoming election through litigation. And then we're also involved in two cases in Pennsylvania, intervening to ensure that individuals are able to drop off an absentee ballot at drop-off boxes. There's, right now, litigation challenging that aspect of the law, but so far we've been successful in ensuring that individuals are able to drop off absentee ballots at drop boxes at county election offices. Secondarily, looking to the second map on this slide for turnout, this is really exciting. Actually, the numbers on this have gone up. We're at nearly 15 million for total early vote so far. And this map really shows, is really indicative of when ballots have gone out in certain states and where early vote has been available already. So even in Texas, they've only had early vote for going on 1 day now, and have already seen 10% of turnout of the electorate that came out in 2016. And then looking to a few states like Washington and Oregon, they have not sent out their absentee ballots yet. They go out, I believe, today in Washington, and will go out in 2 days in Oregon. So we'll see those numbers start flying up in that state, as well as all of their vote by mail ballots go out. But so far, we're already about 10% of the turnout that we saw in 2016, and we're going to see it go much, much higher in my state of Virginia. We're already at 25% of turnout compared to 2016's total turnout. So it's really exciting how many people have already cast a ballot in this election 20 days out. Sonia, if you can move us to the next slide on voter intimidation. This is something that's really been in the news, but hopefully This isn't something that we will see much of, if any, on election day. But certainly looking at the current environment in the United States is something that is on the mind of a lot of folks as they go to cast a ballot. But I just want to reassure folks that it is illegal to intimidate voters, and it is a federal crime. I think just to give you some examples of what is voter intimidation, it could be aggressively questioning voters about their citizenship or criminal records or other qualifications to vote as they attempt to cast a ballot. It could be falsely representing oneself as an election official. Could be displaying false or misleading signs about voter fraud or related criminal penalties. It could be other forms of harassment, particularly targeting non-English speakers or voters of color. And then lastly, it could also be spreading of false information about voter requirements or the voting process. So if someone is intentionally telling individuals incorrect information about the process of casting a ballot, it is considered voter intimidation under federal law. However, if you do spot or have any issues with voter intimidation, what you can do is call 866-OUR-VOTE. This is our election protection hotline. This hotline is there for reporting issues at polling locations and is there to provide a resource for voters that have questions. The most common questions that we receive through election protection are, am I registered to vote? Where do I vote? And what identification do I need to bring? I'm certain this year we're going to get a lot more questions about vote by mail that will be leading the list. But there's a terrific resource there. Also, if you have questions and you're online and you'd like to look at aclu.org/voter, we provide a lot of information for folks that are interested in casting a ballot by mail this election. And then, of course, votespa.com, which is a fantastic resource. It's where you can go to register to vote, where you can request an absentee ballot and really look up all the information that you need in order to cast that ballot, albeit where your voting location is, where your county election office is, and all of their information as well. But with that, I think we can turn to questions.
Great, fantastic. Thank you, Sonia and Bobby. A wealth of information that couldn't be more timely and relevant to all of us. We'll open up the event now to questions from the audience. So we've had a couple come in already, and if you have questions, please feel free to add them to the Q&A feature now. So one of the questions that we've had a couple questions come in actually about poll workers, and you mentioned that because of the disproportionate effects that we know that COVID has on older folks, and that it is older folks who have tended to be poll workers in the past, if there is any kind of foreseeable issues around getting new poll workers trained and what that kind of process is going to be like, and if that's going to in any way kind of affect the experience at the polls.
Well, first I will start off with, this is a reoccurring issue every election cycle in terms of recruiting an adequate number of poll workers. I think fortunately this year, there have been so many companies and organizations that have jumped in to help recruit poll workers for Election Day. And many people have been doing, a great deal of help by casting a ballot absentee or voting early in person before Election Day to help alleviate the number of people that will be coming out on Election Day. But from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, this problem kind of differentiates. So in some places, it's still a big need, and election administrators are still looking for folks to sign up and help, be it as a poll worker or helping process absentee ballots at a central absentee precinct on Election Day. So there's just a variety of things that folks can still do to help out. but yes, there's still a bit of a need, and I think one of the concerns this year will be, since many folks have not done this before, that there will be a little bit of a learning curve, especially in the morning of election day, and then hopefully making sure that all of the new folks who've signed up show up and participate as poll workers on election day.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. An audience member mentions that they've heard that ballots have been thrown away or sent to the wrong person. And so is this accurate? And is there any reason to be concerned about mail-in voting at a scale that's never really been attempted before?
I will say I'm not aware of ballots being thrown away in a jurisdiction. I think there was a report out of West Virginia where a temporary worker did accidentally place some UOCAVA ballots, which are ballots sent over from overseas, and they looked different, and didn't understand what they had done, and put them in the wastebasket and then were fired. But that was more of a misunderstanding than malice. And part of that is just because the way in which voters vote on UOCAVA ballots just looks a little bit different than a regular ballot that would be available in an election office. Secondly, I'll say that this has happened on scale before in states like Colorado, Oregon, Washington. This has been the norm, and we have not seen election fraud in those states. Oregon started this process, was the first state to conduct all-mail elections in the 2000 presidential election, and have been able to do so without issue since then. Secondly, there are verification processes put in place to ensure that the individuals who returned the ballots were the ones who requested them. There is a signature verification process that is built into these systems to help ensure that as voters request and cast absentee ballots, that they're doing so in a manner that is safe, secure, and trusted.
Great, thanks. Maybe one more question about ballots before we move on to kind of another topic. So what should we do if we request an absentee mail-in ballot and it doesn't show up?
I can jump on that one. What you can do is you can still go vote on election day, or you can vote, you can possibly go to your, I'm not certain of the law on this in Pennsylvania, but I believe you can go to your county clerk's office, let them know that your ballot has not arrived, and request a secondary one. What generally occurs in most states is that if your ballot has not arrived before election day and you would like to cast a ballot, you can go into your local precinct and you will cast what is considered a provisional ballot. The way that a provisional ballot works is it's separated, it's put in an envelope and separated from other ballots, and they will check it during the canvassing period. All election results on election night are unofficial, and they don't really have the official results until a post-election canvass occurs, generally in kind of the next few days after an election. And at that point, election administrators determine whether or not that ballot should be counted. In this case, the way in which they will determine it is looking at your name on the provisional ballot and checking to see if an absentee ballot came in with your name on it. If there isn't an absentee ballot that was counted under your name, that provisional ballot will then be counted. This happens semi-frequently, in particular with voters or elderly voters who oftentimes request an absentee ballot, sometimes cast it, and then don't remember if they cast it or not and come to a polling location on election day. So there's sometimes occurrences where that provisional ballot isn't counted, but folks are being cautious and making sure that they are able to cast a ballot on election day.
I'll
Great.
add, with respect to provisional ballots, federal law requires that your election authority let you know whether your provisional ballot counted or not and the reasons for the rejection. So you can always call your election authority and ask them. Same thing with respect to, well, not same thing, but with respect to absentee ballots, you can also just call your elections office and say, hey, I never got my ballot, where is it? A lot of times these folks will have, unfortunately, it's not everywhere, sadly, it's elections being underfunded, but they have ballot tracking systems in which they can let you know that a ballot's gone out or a ballot has been received. So if you cast your ballot by mail absentee, you can call your election office to see if it's been received.
Great, thank you. So we have a question about a very timely decision from yesterday. Participants asking if you can share your thoughts on yesterday's Supreme Court decision that allows the census to not be extended due to COVID.
That is a very good question. So yes, the Supreme Court essentially called what they call stayed a lower court's preliminary injunction that had granted the plaintiff's request to extend the census count to the end of October. So just getting a little bit more into sort of the details of what I discussed. Sorry, my microphone went out. Apologize for that. Email me if you have questions. So basically, the Census Bureau, with the agreement of the Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, who is also a political appointee, requested for Congress to extend the statutory deadlines, and also had itself internally extended the count itself to a month after it had originally planned on ending the count because of the implications of COVID. And then all of a sudden one day, the White House said, no, we're not doing that. And so our colleagues at other organizations filed a lawsuit to essentially require the Census Bureau to extend the census count in order to ensure that there's a full and accurate count to the extent possible under the COVID conditions. A federal district court in California granted a preliminary injunction after hearing from both parties, basically saying yes, right? Like this seems appropriate. And what the Supreme Court essentially did was stay that decision pending an appeal. So what that means, that decision on hold. But my understanding because the White House wants to end the count right away, effectively it could mean that the count has now ended, right? And so the practical implications of that is there is potentially a historic undercount in this census. And the question now then becomes, how do you remedy that, right? What is Congress's role in remedying that? Can a future administration do something within its executive authority to correct a potential undercount? So these are all questions that have never come up before, and organizations like the ACLU and some others are working with members of Congress to try to answer. It's a very good question. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer than that.
Thank you. We have a question about concerns in California about misleading or placing misleading ballot boxes. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to that and kind of what the consequences are of this and what it might mean for voters.
Dr. Bobby, I'll let you take that one.
Sure. So for those of you who haven't heard about this story, the Republican Party of California put out boxes in, I believe, LA County, stating, they were just unsecured boxes that said official Dropbox on them that were then, collecting absentee ballots, and they had sent out information that if folks wanted to drop off their mail-in ballots, that was a place for them to do so. The Secretary of State of California then responded by sending a cease and desist letter to the California Republican Party. I believe they are currently in some negotiations about how to address this. I think, first and foremost, they should not say official drop boxes on them. That should only be state drop boxes that are labeled as such. Secondarily, I feel like the security of those drop boxes will be really called into question, because it is, if you are going to collect ballots for individuals, there is a responsibility to ensure that it is in a secure fashion. As an institution, ACLU and our affiliates in California have been sending out information about where the correct official state sanctioned drop boxes are. And I think right now we're waiting to see what response comes from the California GOP, but hopefully they respond in a responsible fashion, and at the very least do not label their containers as official state drop boxes.
Bobby, do you want to also talk about for a second, as a fun little contrast exercise, the lawsuit that was brought in Pennsylvania to prohibit drop boxes?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that Sonia touched on earlier, where in 1 10-minute span, we will see folks saying that voter fraud exists and that no one should vote by mail, and then quickly turn and say, please turn in your absentee ballots as quickly as possible. So it is difficult that the state party, the Republican Party in Pennsylvania, is challenging the ability of voters to drop off their ballots at election offices that are maintained by state election and state and local election administrators, and are taking measures to ensure that the ballots are secure, and saying that will lead to fraud, but then at the same time putting out their own drop boxes in California, stating that they're doing so in a safe and secure fashion.
Great, thank you. Can you speak to what, if anything, that we can do or you will be doing at the ACLU in the days and potentially weeks after the election, when we might still be waiting on results?
So we're going to be doing a lot of work encouraging voters to cast a ballot this election. So if you know folks that are not yet registered, let them know to register, particularly in Pennsylvania, where we are so close to the registration deadline. We're going to be doing a lot of voter education work in that time, informing individuals about civil rights and civil liberties that are impacted by the upcoming election. And then during the day of election, we participate with election protection. So we put down the 866-R-VOTE. So if folks are interested in volunteering with election protection, you can sign up at 866rvote.com and participate as a poll observer, or help answer questions from individuals as they come in on election day. And then lastly, after the election, I think the most important thing we can do is be patient, especially in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, where in those two states are going to be battlegrounds, are going to be pivotal for the presidential election. They don't start processing absentee ballots until the day of the election. So the way that process works is they do all of the signature verification that we talked about a little bit earlier, which takes time. They then remove the ballots from the envelope. They're still in a secrecy envelope. They separate those out. Then they take the ballots out of the secrecy envelopes, flatten them out, and feed them into a tabulator. Given the large amount of mail-in and absentee ballots that are going to be occurring this year in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, I think we need to really be cognizant of that fact and realize that it could be days or even weeks waiting for the official election results to be given, even though most election cycles we're able to make decisions based off of the unofficial election results that are provided by the media on election night.
Great, thanks. Sonia, in the beginning, you really talked about kind of the arc and the history of voter suppression within the US. And so thinking post-election, which I know is almost impossible to do right now, what can we do, or what will the ACLU be doing following the election to address ongoing efforts at suppressing the vote? And what do you maybe anticipate the next strategy or tactic being from those looking to make voting more difficult, particularly with the gutting of the 1965 Voting Rights Act? And what can we do to be proactive and ready? Oh, you need to unmute yourself.
I'm really good at this. I said, I love that question. Thank you for that. I'll talk about what ACLU is planning on doing, what ACLU plans on doing, and me as sort of the federal advocate on behalf of ACLU and Congress. And then I'm gonna talk about what folks I think folks should be focusing on. I do think we've kind of hit like this precipice with COVID and voter suppression, because even having been in this game for like 10 plus years, I was not so cynical as to think that politicians would be using the pandemic to suppress voting rights. I mean, it has been truly shocking to me that that is sort of where we're at. And then the inability of Congress to say, essentially send money and set rules in place to ensure people can vote. I mean, this is a huge federal legislative failure, right? So I think that if there is favorable conditions in Congress, in the next Congress, I do think that voting rights is going to be front and center in terms of federal legislation. The House Democrats this year passed a bill called HR 1, which is an enormous election reform bill that would create really robust rules for permitting people to vote in federal elections. So instituting nationwide things like same-day registration, no excuse absentee voting. So I think that is going to be something that happens next Congress. I also think next Congress that if there are favorable conditions in the House and in the Congress and the White House, that the federal government will enact the fixed version of the Voting Rights Act, which the ACLU has been advocating for since Shelby County happened. And that is absolutely necessary, because with the loss of Section 5, we also are not seeing what's happening on the local level. We're really kind of responding to these big ticket things that are happening, at sort of the state level. But the sort of beauty of Section 5 was that even local jurisdictions had to submit their voting changes to the Department of Justice. And so we were able to see what was happening there. It mostly had to do with like diluting minority voting rights. So like changes to methods of elections, redistricting, racial gerrymandering, things like that. So I hope that we can see that next Congress. In terms of what folks can do post-election, Bobby might have some ideas too, but I would recommend a couple things. One is start to think about participating in your jurisdiction's election administration process. Whether that mean going to meetings of the Board of Elections or the county council or whoever, makes decisions on how people can vote. Become a poll worker, a permanent poll worker, right? You can also educate. I know it sounds really hokey, but I mean, educating your friends and family is huge. Like I have not seen in my whole career the level of voter information as we are seeing now in every facet of our lives. It has been amazing. And so don't look past the importance of educating the people around you on what their rights are. I would also encourage you, because we are going to be in another redistricting cycle, which happens every 10 years after the census, participate in that process. The public has a right to participate in that process, and the rules vary from state to state. But that is something that you should absolutely be focusing on, and making sure that there are fair maps that represent people fairly. Bobby, anything? He also has good ideas.
I'll just reiterate what you said. I loved all the ideas.
Okay.
Well, I think that's maybe a perfect place for us to wrap up. I want to thank again Sonia Gill and Bobby Hoffmann for joining us tonight. 3 weeks before the election, this couldn't be a busier time for you, and we're so grateful for sharing your insights and your knowledge as we both commemorate the 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment and also recognize the ongoing threats to the right to vote, which disproportionately affect Black people and people of color. So thank you for your work, thank you for your advocacy, and for being here with us tonight. And with that, we're going to end the event. Good night and vote.
Thank you.
Thanks.